After the next presidential election, right now we're gathering the names of all these politicians that you mentioned that might be on our side, and there's a lot of them. And we're telling them, we're not going to release your name. We're going to hold on to it, but in 2 years we're going to come back to you with such a huge organization that we can show you you won't lose one more vote than you gain if you support these policies of ending drug prohibition. And if we show them that, I think they will end this thing, because it is an absolute disaster. And we know from looking around the world that if we legalize and regulate drugs, we can reduce death, disease, crime, and drug addiction. Because there's other countries where they've leaned, every other country where they've even leaned toward ending some of the repression of the drug laws, everything has gotten better after they've done it. Are you aware of what happened in Portugal? That Portugal decriminalized all drugs, right, in July of 2001. That's 8 years ago. Okay, so they got quite a record. And not only did they decriminalize all drugs, but they said you can have up to 10 days supply of your personal choice of drug and nobody's going to arrest you. You'd think that would cause a chaos, but exactly the opposite happened. Drug use for every category of drug went down, save one, which was marijuana, and it only increased slightly. And a study that was just done last May, published last May by Eric Greenwald on this thing, shows that where he compared the 8 years after Portugal decriminalized with the 8 years of all the other European countries that didn't decriminalize, and the other countries where they didn't decriminalize, marijuana use increased by 4 to 5 times the per capita rate it did in Portugal.
In the last 40 years?
Especially it dropped with the young people. Young people between the ages of 13 to 15, drug use declined by 25%. For people between the ages of 16 and 18, it's down 22%. Heroin overdose deaths are down 52% since they decriminalized. They're still using that same nasty heroin that they buy on the street that they don't know how much of it is really the drug and how much the cutting agent, which is what kills them, by the way. And that is not a function of the drug, that's a function of prohibition, because when you have prohibition, there's no control or regulation over how it's produced. So we could end all those. But they've cut overdose deaths by 52% because they no longer treat these people as criminals, because they treat them as people with a health problem, and they're not now afraid of taking a friend to a clinic when they're overdosing. So they're saving lives, see?
So the conclusion to all this is that ending prohibition is really the solution to many of these drug problems.
I think it's the only solution, and if people just think seriously about what prohibition means, you know, the drug lawyers would tell you prohibition means we're controlling drugs. Well, it's exactly the opposite. It is total lack of control of drugs. The people that control it when you prohibit it are the criminals. What happens when you prohibit a drug, any drug? The first thing that happens is you create an underground market for that drug that's instantly filled with criminals. And now, because that drug is dangerous to supply, because it's illegal, you know, you can go to jail for life, you can get killed by cops or other drug dealers. Because of the danger itself, it creates an artificially inflated value for these drugs that is so huge that between where they're grown mainly in developing countries like Colombia or Afghanistan, where they're sold in Europe or the United States, that value can increase by more than 17,000%. Think of what an obscene profit motive that is. The only way to end this is to do away with that profit motive. See, I learned very early on out there living on the streets with those folks, for 14 years I was out there, that if a uniformed cop arrests somebody in your neighborhood for, say, robbery or for rape, the number of robberies, the number of rapes goes down, right? You got the guy. But when I arrested somebody for selling drugs, the number of drug sales didn't change at all. I was simply creating a job opening for hundreds of people more than willing to take the risk for this obscene profit motive. That's why marijuana is a weed. It'll grow anywhere in the world. It's useless, it's worthless, as long as it's legal. But once you prohibit it, marijuana is worth more gram per gram than gold. It's a weed. Heroin, from another weed, from an opium poppy, which will grow anywhere in the world, is practically useless, is worth more than plutonium. Heroin is probably the most expensive commodity on the face of the earth. But if we legalized it, those prices would fall down to nothing. It wouldn't even be worth it for people to sell on the streets.
Where does all this money go now?
$500 billion a year is spent on illegal drugs around the world every year. That money goes mainly into the pockets of drug lords, terrorists, and when I say terrorists, I really mean terrorists. Osama bin Laden made almost all of his money selling heroin out of Afghanistan in the United States, and then he turned those profits around to try to destroy our society. If we legalized these drugs today, tomorrow there wouldn't be a terrorist or a drug lord in the world that'd make a penny.
So one could say that prohibition is really a security risk.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. And it's also a terrible risk for business people. You know, think $500 billion coming in to an individual or a bunch of individuals. They've got to launder that money. How do they launder it? They create phony businesses. Businesses that don't have to make a profit. Construction companies, hotels, restaurants. How can any honest business person possibly compete with those people? It's impossible. So this is also good for them. It's also good for, we could tax it and actually make revenue off this stuff. We commissioned a study with Harvard University a year ago with a professor, Jeffrey Myron, and we asked him to do a study that would just show us how much money the United States Treasury would realize if we legalized and regulated all drugs and just taxed them at the level of alcohol or tobacco. And he's a very conservative economist, and he came up with a bare minimum of $76.8 billion a year that the U.S. Treasury would realize. That, you're talking a lot of money. That kind of money, with that kind of money, we could offer health care for everyone. You can pay for the whole thing. But instead, we let all that money go to the drug lords, who don't have to pay a penny of tax. It's just wrong-headed.
So prohibition is a security problem, it's a problem for economy, it's a problem for, well, democratic control of the economy.
And it's certainly a problem for those 1.9 million people that we arrest in the United States every single year for nonviolent drug offenses. Think about what that number is. What do you got, 5.3 million people here in this country? In 3 years, we arrest more people in the United States for nonviolent drug offenses than you have in your entire country. Think of how much harm we're doing to people. And when you arrest somebody and imprison them, and we imprison more people than any country in the world, far more. When you do that, they come out, they have no education, they have no chance of getting a job. The only place they can turn is right back to the drug culture, the very group we say we're trying to save them from. So every year it gets worse than it was the year before. The more people we arrest, the worse it is the next year.
Right. So the cure is actually worse than the original problem. That is what is going on.
Yeah. When you're talking about a war on drugs, the cure is certainly worse than the problem, far worse. We could live with the problem of drug abuse. Nobody at LEAP, by the way, wants to see one additional drug abuser in the world. We spent our entire adult lives, our whole career, working against that. And we haven't changed our mind. We just know that if we legalize and regulate these drugs, we will reduce death, disease, crime, and addiction. What could be better than that? Are you aware of what's going on in Switzerland?
Yeah, they have this heroin
Clinics.
Clinics, yeah.
Yeah, they set up 23 heroin clinics as a pilot project 15 years ago because they were tired of arresting their children for making the mistake of using heroin. They said, we're going to treat this as a health problem. Heroin users can go in up to 3 times a day into those clinics and actually inject heroin. They can also take substitute drugs, buprenorphine or methadone. But I'm interested in the ones that shoot the heroin. About 20% of the people in that project have quit using any drug at all. They haven't had a single overdose death there in 15 years because they're shooting up under medical supervision. They're using clean needles. Because they're using clean needles, AIDS and hepatitis, the per capita rate in Switzerland has now dropped that country to the lowest rate of any country in the world or in Europe. That's an amazing success. They're helping, defeat these terrible diseases. Crime was cut by 60%. The heroin is distributed to the users on a sliding scale, but if you have no money, it's free. So that means a heroin user doesn't have to break into your house at night and steal your television set or something to pay for the drugs. So none of those crimes exist. And because the drugs are effectively free, there's no dopers on the streets where these projects are selling heroin, because you can't beat free. Who would buy from you, right? Especially when they can get pure government heroin with no cutting in, and they know what they're taking. So if the dope dealers aren't on the streets selling it, they're not killing each other, cops or kids. So all the violence is gone. And the biggest thing, even more important than that, there was a study that just was done by the very prestigious British medical journal, The Lancet, that shows that over a 10-year period in the capital of Zurich, there has been an 82% decline in new drug users. 82% less new heroin users. And what they attribute that to is they say the dope dealers are no longer in the neighborhoods, rubbing shoulders with our young people to convince them to pick up those drugs and become the next statistic. So a year ago, last month, they had a referendum vote in Switzerland, and they voted to make this a permanent policy throughout the entire country. And why not? They figured out a way to reduce death, disease, crime, and drug addiction. What could be better? And it's the closest thing we have to legalized drugs in the world.